Welcome everyone to the Phoenix Report. I am Jack Connor. As we record this, it is Monday, September 18th, 2017, and we have the sad news to reflect on the passing of Bobby the Brain Heenan, arguably the greatest manager in the history of pro wrestling. He was, also a wrestler, a color commentator, and just a really larger than life personality. Obviously, it wasn't too much of a shock to hear about him passing. He had been in poor health for a long time. He passed away yesterday at the age of 72 at his home in Largo. And I know me and my two main panelists on my wrestling podcast. Obviously, Bobby Heenan meant a lot to all of us. He was a big part of our childhood. So I'm just gonna bring the guys in. First of all, we have Cory W of Chronocord, aka C-Dub. He's a musician, producer, and all-around wrestling historian.
Who?
I was talking about you.
Of course. I had to get that in there. I had to get the Bobby Heenanism in there. As you know, a friend in need is a pest, and so for all you humanoids, here I am.
Nice. And of course, he's a former FCW referee, comedian, musician, and Bobby Heenan was his hero. I know that, and so I know it's really impacted you, Brian Connolly.
I proudly call myself Brain Colony in honor of Bobby the Brain Heenan. Not a lot of people know that, but yeah, this is a sad day.
It's actually your new Twitter handle, I think. We'll get into that, but
yeah.
But yeah, no, I'm sure you guys felt the same way I did, where it's like, we kind of knew this was a long time coming, given his health situation over the years. Obviously, he had really hung on and fought for a lot of years, but he had definitely had a rough go of it.
73 is not too bad for for a wrestler these days, though. He's part of a generation that. Yeah, he still got a few of them around. You got the Iron Sheik and Nikolai Volkov and those guys, but yeah, living up to your 70s is pretty rare in the wrestling business.
I guess so. Sorry, Cory?
Yeah, without question. I think just the fact that even though Bobby was in pretty poor health, I think it's pretty encouraging that he spent his last few years making the convention appearances that he could and going out and being in public. Yeah, it was really good to see Bobby out there still making public appearances on conventions and stuff like that, and still seeing the fans. Certainly with his physical condition being the way it was, that couldn't have been too easy. But Bobby was out there and still seeing his fans and making the most of life, and not just waiting on his number to get called.
For sure. I think he was actually even on Twitter at one point. Is that right, Brian?
I'm not sure if that was legit or not. I think that might, and if it was probably his wife.
Right.
But yeah, he lived in nearby Largo.
Right.
It's like 15 minutes from me, and I actually just saw him at WrestleMania this year at the WrestleCon. Yeah, and he's still funny when he goes to take pictures. He gives you the middle finger, and still being the Brain.
Gotcha. Obviously, I don't even need to tell anyone who knows you, Brian, knows how much you loved Bobby Heenan and how much of an influence he was. What did he mean to you?
Well, I like how sometimes you would refer to me as the Bobby Heenan to your Gorilla Monsoon.
Right.
Like that. Bobby Heenan to me, and I'm now going to include him in my favorite list of comedians. When people ask who are your comedic influences, we'll say Weird Al. Of course, we'll say George Carlin, and then I'll have to add Bobby Heenan to the list because his comedic timing was very underrated, if you ask me. He had such a quick wit, and Gorilla Monsoon really brought out the best in him in riling him up on air. And the first thing I watched last night was the Royal Rumble from '92.
Yeah,
just because of how legendary, how biased he is, pulling for Flair the entire time.
I remember
and telling Gorilla to put up his dukes at one point.
I'll have to go back.
Shut up.
I'll have to go back and watch that. I remember when
I recommend anybody that does that.
When Roddy Piper passed away, you remember stuff he was saying in that match about Roddy, and it was like,
yeah.
At first he was on his side, but then he was like, "No, he wears a skirt." And,
yeah, skirt wearing freak.
right. I apologize, Roddy. It's a kilt. It's not a skirt.
And then he says at one point, "It's not fair to Flair," and he said, "You know what's not fair to Flair? That he's still even in there right now."
Right.
I love that.
Gotcha.
It's like an hour very entertaining comedy from Bobby Heenan there.
Absolutely, Cory. I know you certainly know about this, but not a lot of people know that Bobby Heenan was originally a wrestler, especially in his younger days.
Oh yeah. Pretty boy Bobby Heenan was he was the bump machine, man. Back in his day, he was the classic archetype of the chicken shit heel. Would run his mouth and then eventually get his comeuppance. Bobby was really known as a guy who could make anybody look great. It seemed like back in the 70s, if you go and look at just about any of the independent wrestling magazines that were being ran back then, just about every other issue, you're going to see a picture of Bobby Heenan busted open on the cover. So, and then later on, he ended up going on and being a manager. He was kind of almost like a player coach of sorts there for a few years once the injuries started to get to him. But
yeah, I was going to ask about when he made that transition, because I see that especially in his early days he would manage tag teams like the Valiant Brothers and the Blackjacks. Was there a particular like injury or event that made him want to be on the sidelines as opposed to an in-ring worker?
Yeah, he had a neck injury, I believe, in the early '80s that really put a damper on his bumping. He would still, take bumps on occasion in his WWF tenure, but pretty much from the early '80s on, his active in-ring performances kind of got cold.
Right. I know. Certainly. I see in 1974 was when he started working for the AWA and Vern Gagne. I know that was where he really sort of developed his persona of the Brain and his whole. He sort of worked on his act there. Managing guys like Nick Bockwinkel and Ray Stevens, and that really kind of helped him flesh out his character a little bit more. I'm sure like on the network they have to have a lot of like AWA footage of him in those early days.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure there's quite a few events out there you can find either on the network or on YouTube or elsewhere online. But I gotta say, talking about Ray Stevens and Nick Bockwinkel, two guys that Heenan managed, of all the wrestlers that Bobby Heenan could have managed who did not need him and his talking abilities, Nick Bockwinkel was the guy. Nick Bockwinkel could sell sand at the beach.
Right.
So combining that with Bobby Heenan, it was a really, really effective partnership, and it made for a good way to draw heat toward Bockwinkel and Crippler Stevens as well.
The closest thing I can think of in like a modern day pairing like that would be, I guess, when Paul Heyman briefly managed CM Punk.
Yes.
Where it's like you had a guy who could already talk. Like he didn't really need an extra mouthpiece, but having that extra element there just kind of added to him, especially when he was trying to get legit heel heat.
Yeah, definitely.
Gotcha. So I know, certainly Bockwinkel was another guy who was just absolute gold on the mic. Just a big influence on Chris Jericho's career. I know that. Brian, do you know anything about the AWA days, or
I to be honest, I am strictly WWF.
Right. I wasn't sure because I knew you were such a fan of Bobby Heenan. I didn't know how much of his earlier career you knew about.
I got into WWF around 1986 or 7, and so that's like the prime time Heenan family era is when I got sucked in there.
Right. And so it looks like it was around 1984 was when he got called up to New York and started working for Vince. Originally, apparently, I didn't know this either. He was originally got brought in to manage Jesse Ventura, but by that time, Jesse Ventura's in-ring career was winding down.
That's right.
And ironically, both of those guys became like the prototypical heel color commentators.
And both killed it on commentary with Gorilla Monsoon.
Absolutely. I felt this way for a long time, and I don't know how either of you guys feel about this. I mean, I'm sure you, Cory, have some opinions on this, but in terms of like babyface and heel announcers, I feel like that's almost a bit of a lost art nowadays. I feel like you have a lot of like announcers who kind of flip flop from babyface and heel, and it's not really like consistent between each characters. I mean, do you think I'm off base there, or what do you think about that?
I think we still have the babyface, the neutral, and the heel announcers and color commentators, but I don't think that anybody has really got the formula down just right, like Bobby Heenan and to some degree Jesse Ventura had it, to where they really enhance what's going on without stepping on top of it and overshadowing it. Like can happen sometimes with like a JBL or something. It gets a little bit over the top with his shtick, but I mean, I think that's in many ways is a lost art. I do think that Cory Graves currently has done his best to bring those attributes to his announcing work, but it's definitely a lost art.
Yeah, Cory Graves for sure has the right idea in mind. You can tell he's channeling Heenan at times and putting down Saxton like he would Gorilla.
Yes.
Yeah, which is good. I like that dynamic of a announce team. You can't just have three straight-laced guys calling wrestling action. You got to have one heel in there. Just makes for a better announce team, in my opinion.
I agree. I think the one thing that's mainly missing from a lot of commentary now is that you'll have like the heel commentators, but you won't really have like the babyface commentator who is an actual foil to the heel commentators. Like you don't really have that gorilla type character in there who's going to call out the heel commentators like on their BS.
Yeah, I honestly miss old JR and when the King was a heel. It was a similar situation.
I think those guys were a fantastic team because they had the same thing, especially during the Attitude Era. Where King was the heel and JR would just banter back and forth, and you had that give and take there.
The King was obsessed with puppies and always rooting for the bad guys,
or even to a later degree when Paul Heyman took over for Lawler for a little bit.
Yeah, that was great. I loved those days.
Yeah, and I think really the magic ingredient in the common ingredient in all of those announced teams that you mentioned is that all of those guys were friends off the air as well. They had a relationship off the air.
Right.
By every indication, Heenan and Gorilla Monsoon were the best of friends, and so being able to have that banter back and forth as you're traveling the roads, that really brings things to a much easier level of achievability whenever you're in front of a camera, whenever it's so natural to have that back and forth.
What's crazy from a pay-per-view standpoint with Gorilla and Bobby is they only did like 6 or 7 pay-per-views together, but it was in a run from 91 to 93 when they didn't have that many pay-per-views anyway. But we mostly remember their banter on primetime wrestling, but as far as like calling pay-per-views, it only went from WrestleMania 7 to the 93 Survivor Series, I believe, was the only pay-per-views that they called.
Yeah, they were mainly known for like the backstage stuff, like primetime wrestling and everything. And we'll get into that in just a second. But obviously, when what Bobby's most known for, I would think, would be his managing. Certainly, when he came in right off the bat, he would manage guys like Big John Studd, and then eventually, and then obviously the biggest one would be Andre during WrestleMania 3.
Yeah. That's when I started watching, was that whole Hogan-Andre build-up.
And it seemed like it would continue like this for almost seemed like the rest of the 80s, where you would have sort of a formula of Bobby Heenan being a constant factor of always trying to recruit guys to the Heenan family to take on Hogan. So in a real way, Bobby was, without being a full-time in-ring guy, was one of the top guys at the company.
Oh, absolutely.
No doubt about that. He managed Bundy at WrestleMania 2.
Yeah.
He was a major component of the WrestleMania 1 build-up, and a lot of those storylines. He was, of course, the manager of John Studd against Andre the Giant at that pay-per-view, which was one of the cornerstone matchups of that event. And then, as you said, he took on Andre the Giant in what was probably the biggest storyline ever. Certainly the biggest of Hogan's career, if you ask me.
Right.
And led Andre to face Hogan at WrestleMania 3 and eventually to capture the championship, albeit under controversial circumstances.
2-5-88, never forget.
That's right, absolutely.
Definitely. Are we talking about Are we talking about the one where because DiBiase bought it from Andre?
Yeah,
right?
We're talking about the dueling Hepners incident.
Oh yeah, where Dave and Earl were there.
That was huge.
How much was the plastic surgery, brother?
That was the most watched wrestling program still to this date.
Yep.
Highest rated.
I mean, people must have been losing their minds when they saw something like that, especially if they didn't know that.
I was 8 years old, and my mind was blown out of my skull. I had no idea what I was seeing.
Freaking out, like, what is going on here?
Yeah, it was beyond shocking.
I'm sure. I mean, gosh, you look at, such a list of talents that he managed at that time. You mentioned Big John Studd, King Kong Bundy, Paul Orndorff, the Brainbusters, Arn and Tully, Rick Rude, Harley Race. Yeah.
A lot of these guys he led to championships too, which was the thing about him, was like he was a weasel, and but he was successful. Like Ric Flair and Rick Rude all had lengthy title reigns. Mr. Perfect was a multi-time Intercontinental Champion, and the Brainbusters won the tag titles, and even with Andre, he was successful.
Of course,
so
he
was a good man. He was a great manager to have in your corner to be one of Hogan's foils or whoever.
For sure, yeah. No, I forgot about Mr. Perfect, and of course, when Ric Flair came up in 91, 92, Flair was
the real world champion, man.
Right. That was huge when that
they were blurring out the rival company's championship title on television.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy when you think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially, that's like the Monday Night Wars before they ever began.
Exactly.
It absolutely was. It's really hard to put into words and to explain to somebody who's a modern-day wrestling fan just what a huge deal it was to see in the summer of 1991, to see Bobby Heenan show up on Wrestling Challenge or Superstars out of seemingly nowhere with the WCW championship, with Ric Flair's championship. I mean, that was just...
Did Bobby Heenan introduce Brother Love too?
I believe he did. I believe so, yes.
I feel like, I remember that connection, because then later on Primetime, he was dressed up as Brother Love for a Halloween episode.
Right.
That's right.
I think later in his run, I believe he kind of introduced Jim Cornette to the WWE.
Actually, I guess he did. That's right, in '93. I guess it was '93 or '94. Whenever Cornette came in with, I believe it was the Heavenly Bodies first.
Right. They tried to make it seem like Cornette was like a protege of his or something like that.
Exactly, which, I mean, you don't get any better than that. At that point, Heenan was the ultimate, conniving miser of the managerial department in the WWF.
Yeah, and Cornette seemed to be the heir apparent to that.
Oh, definitely.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I'm kind of taken aback at the... There's a few missteps that Heenan tried his best with, but Playboy Buddy Rose was one of his...
Right. Oh, yeah. He was an AWA guy, I know that.
Well, it says in his WWF years.
Yeah, that was pretty early.
Yeah.
That was like
and then
84.
And then you have to bring up the Brooklyn Brawler and the Red Rooster.
Of course.
That whole angle.
Yeah, the whole angle on Primetime of Heenan taking on the Red Rooster and then eventually dropping him and bringing on the Brooklyn Brawler to attack.
Primetime really did have a lot of big angles with him back in the day. Like, they treated it like almost better than they treat Monday Night Raw now as far as storylines on a weekly basis, like bleeding into each other.
Well, like, I think did Tuesday Night Titans come before Primetime Wrestling?
Yeah, pretty sure.
Because that whole format I thought was genius, really. When you think in terms of like developing characters, It was really interesting. I'm amazed that like USA Network let them get away with some of the stuff.
Can you imagine? Yeah, can you imagine Vince McMahon hosting that show now, or any kind of variation of it?
Well, I mean, the closest we had until recently was like Talking Smack.
Right.
And but I mean, stuff like that is just so invaluable to getting these guys over as personalities, I think.
Oh yeah, and I mean TNT and even Primetime were perfect vehicles for Heenan's. I mean, his wit was so fast and so sharp. He could come back from anything, and he was constantly thinking on his feet. I mean, it was.
The matches were nothing great either on Primetime. There was just the banter in between, where they would set up the clips, made it a watchable show to me.
For sure. For those of you listening who might not be familiar with those shows, Tuesday Night Titans and later Primetime Wrestling were. This was before Monday Night Raw, so they would format their shows a lot differently, where they would intercut matches kind of anchored by like talk show type segments. Like Tuesday Night Titans was almost set up like a late night talk show where Vince was the host, and then that morphed into Primetime Wrestling, which was just like sort of a compilation of matches being shown from events, across the country, and but being hosted by Gorilla and Bobby Heenan. I think later Roddy Piper would take over for Gorilla as well.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. Interestingly enough, Primetime actually started out not hosted by either Bobby Heenan or Gorilla Monsoon, but Jack Reynolds and Jesse Ventura. That didn't last nearly as long, and I think once everybody realized that Heenan was just absolute gold on there with Gorilla, it was pretty well locked.
Heenan had as we're talking about Primetime Wrestling, since we're on the subject, another infamous incident would be later in like 91, 92, when Mr. Perfect took the place of, was it the Ultimate Warrior?
Right.
In a tag team match. And, I'll never forget that incident when Mr. Perfect broke away from Bobby Heenan, and it was just one of those things you didn't expect to see.
Yeah, I think that was the first time he had a babyface run, wasn't it?
Mr. Perfect?
Yeah.
Yeah, I believe so.
Because I guess
and that was cool.
I guess
that was always cool.
Did that happen? Like, I guess that was one of the times where Warrior left, or
yeah, Warrior got suspended, I believe, for failing a drug test.
Was it that, or did he like no show a pay-per-view?
That was a year before.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So when he came back, it was another brief. That's what sucked about Warrior, man, is I loved seeing him, but he never came back for very long. So
definitely. Well, I mean, he certainly had his issues, but that's another podcast
in
and of itself. But
Bobby Heenan wasn't shy about sharing his opinions on the Self-Destruction of Ultimate Warrior DVD about
he
kind of guy Bobby Warrior was.
Yeah, he was not a fan, but regardless, Bobby was a professional. He would work with everyone, and I never really heard of anyone having a bad thing to say about the guy.
Just to illustrate what kind of guy Bobby was, in an era whenever everybody was selling out to McMahon to go to the WWF and leave the AWA or the NWA, of all the people who left the AWA and just went straight to the WWF, didn't give notice, apparently Bobby Heenan was one of the very few, if not the only, who actually said, you know what, no, I'm going to do this the right way, not burn a bridge, going to finish my dates, and then I'll come work for Vince. So Bobby was despite his personality on television, I mean, it's not like any of us knew him personally, but by all accounts, he was a good man.
And a dedicated family man, too. Married to the same woman, really dedicated father. To your point, Cory, I was watching his documentary earlier today, and there was an interview with Nick Bockwinkel, who's since passed away, but he had said something about where it's like Bobby would come to him and he's like, I'm not sure if I should go there, and and it was Bockwinkel who was like, hey, your obligation is to your family, we're going to be fine, go do it. So that showed he was a loyal guy to his friends.
Yeah, for sure.
So ultimately, I remember watching an interview about Vince No, I should say Vince did an interview like in the documentary about what it was like to give Bobby his own show within Primetime Wrestling, how they didn't even tell the network that they were doing it. And so you had the Bobby Heenan show sort of tacked on to Primetime Wrestling.
Right. Which is a non-wrestling show.
Yeah.
It was just an interview show.
Which was incredibly entertaining, and it's out there on the network. It was in 1989, about midway through '89. Piper ends up coming on and hosting Primetime with Gorilla after a big fallout, and Bobby gets his own show in Studio B, which was essentially like Stupid Human Tricks in many ways. Like,
yeah, it was very much like almost like a pastiche of like Johnny Carson and like Letterman, where he would just have just the weirdest guests. Like, I don't even know where they found these people, if they were actors, but he would have this guy named Jameson as his sidekick, and
oh boy,
he did have Lord Alfred as his announcer though, so that was cool.
Yeah, we got to get a Lord Alfred Hayes reference here.
Of course, it wouldn't be a podcast without it. But
I actually watched a match between Lord Alfred Hayes and Bobby Heenan.
Really, they wrestled each other?
Yeah, it was on the Bobby Heenan DVD as one of the extras.
Wow.
It's hilarious to see. Even back then, they were managers and they had a match, but I think that was in early AWA in the early 80s.
I'm assuming Alfred went over?
I don't even remember.
But yeah, they had like the weirdest like sideshow guests, and I remember watching this recently and I was like, I can't believe this was on TV at one point. I mean,
yeah, for sure.
It was one of those things where it was just like, it was almost so bad, but like the fact that it was Bobby kind of saved it, just because he was like commenting on how ridiculous this was. Like he was
right.
Like if he wasn't as good as he was, like the whole thing would have been just a train wreck.
Yeah, I mean, I think the train wreck aspect of it was kind of the appeal too, because it was a peek into a world that was, ran by Bobby the Brain Heenan.
Right.
And something that they never really did, but it happened, and it got hinted at over the years, was Heenan was constantly criticizing WWF president Jack Tunney. And he used to, of course, the famous line, best president since Noriega. But,
that was timely.
I always wish that they would have given Heenan a run where somehow, in some weird way, he was voted as the new president of the WWF.
Oh, that would have
been amazing.
It could have been amazing. But, unfortunately, I think...
Just to see Gorilla going nuts.
Of course. It would have been so perfect.
There's some miscarriage of justice, Jess.
My favorite... I wish... I'm kind of looking them up here, and I'm failing miserably at trying to find any Bobby Heenan quotes. But I just specifically remember when the Rockers broke up on the barbershop window. When HBK throws Marty through the window. He says, Marty tried to jump out the window to escape. What an act of cowardice.
Right.
That's one of the best moments you could watch in honor of Bobby Heenan, is the Rockers breaking up and him calling it. I always liked how he would predict the winner of the Royal Rumble 1,000 times.
Oh, sure.
And then say his guy won at the end. He's the one that started doing that. A lot of guys do that still to that. Corey Graves does it today, but
yes, no, absolutely.
And then his Tatanka. He'd always stutter.
Yeah, no, he had so many little things like where it's like he wasn't really even calling the match. He would just kind of...
It's actually, these days it would be considered very offensive to some of the people. Be like, hey, how are you? Hey, how are you?
Yeah.
When Tatanka would come out. Yeah, and he didn't give a crap back then, man. That was a great thing about the early 90s and the late 80s is...
No, he was
those
not
guys
PC at all.
Actually, his very last appearance with WWF was the WrestleMania gimmick battle royal.
Yeah,
2017. Him and Mean Gene came back, and they were both of them were smiling ear to ear the entire time.
Oh,
it was just
sure.
It's great to see and great to watch. I just watched that the other night too, And it's not a good match by any means, but but these guys make the most of it, and their one-liners were killing. He said by the time Iron Sheik gets to the ring, it'll be WrestleMania 38.
Right? Yeah.
I love that.
He's talking about Repo Man and all kinds of stuff. It was like,
yeah, Repo Man is nuts.
Right.
Repossessed his mother's own car.
It was great.
Yeah.
What was the deal with the Oinkettes? There would be like several like overweight women that he would have.
Those were the Rosati sisters.
The Rosatis, yeah.
Yeah,
Who were they?
They were
huge fans.
That's right. They were just
Literally.
super fit. Well,
Yeah, literally huge fans of those.
they were northeast area fans. I believe one of the sisters passed away a few years ago, but I'm pretty sure two of the other sisters are still kicking.
That's crazy.
That's awesome.
I mean, I think that was the deal with like Sapphire too. I think she was just like a fan who I guess just got in good with them and ended up becoming a character.
I'm not sure about that.
Sapphire had actually worked a little bit back in the day, and I think the Kansas City territory. But
did she really?
Yeah.
Turns out that name is super racist, by the way.
It is.
Sapphire for Dusty's. We better not even go there.
Yeah, no, I would ask what that is referring to, but it's probably not.
You could just Google Sapphire.
That we just leave that alone. But yeah, I even remember as a kid seeing on Monday Night Raw where Gorilla came back and fired Bobby Heenan, but that was legit. That was his last night. Before he went to WCW.
Yeah. I was kind of bummed. I was kind of bummed to see him in WCW because he didn't seem happy there. And I think if you ask him, he would say he wasn't happy there. He was just doing it because it was a closer commute. He lived in Atlanta, I think, at the time.
Well, yes, I think his daughter was going to college in Alabama, so I think it was like an easier
Yeah.
So like between Atlanta and where his daughter was going to college, it was easier for them to
And I don't blame the guy at all for doing that.
Less travel, lighter schedule, so.
He put down the product and the wrestlers more than he should have because you could tell he wasn't into it.
Yeah, I mean you could still see glimpses of the classic brain, but by every account, and at the time it was a smart move. WCW was throwing out guaranteed money. Vince McMahon was not. Turner opened up the pocketbooks and started paying all the ex-WWE guys, and Heenan cashed in and made good for his family. It was a smart move at the time. But
can't forget Pillman grabbing his neck.
Oh, yeah.
And that legitimately pissed him off because Heenan's got a bad neck.
Probably my favorite Heenan quote from the WCW era would be when Lex Luger showed up on Nitro in the Mall of America. And he was just calling. I was like, "What? It's a public mall. He could be."
Yeah, why can't he be here?
I think I gotta say, even though the moments for Bobby Heenan, I think a lot of his fans will find more from the WWF era than from the WCW era. There was a match on, I believe it was WCW Worldwide or Saturday Night, featuring Hacksaw Duggan. And it had Tony Schiavone and Bobby Heenan on commentary, and Tony mentioned that Jim Duggan went to college, and for the rest of the match, it's just Bobby Heenan just completely losing his shit, cracking up laughing at the idea of Jim Duggan
going to college.
That's great.
It's fantastic.
Well, no, I was just gonna say I'm surprised that like Bobby They never tried to put him as part of the NWO.
They kind of did at one point.
Did they?
Really? Well, not exactly. It was more of a deal where he was at the broadcast booth. I want to say this was in late '96, early '97. He just basically said, "You know what, guys? I'm tired of getting chased off of this set every week, getting threatened, and if you can't beat him, join him." And like 2 weeks later, he came back, and of course, he's, what are you guys talking about? I never said that. I never turned my back on him.
Denied it completely.
Of course. Perfect. So those classic Bobby Heenan.
How about his weasel suit matches that he had over the years?
Yeah, I think that had originated in the AWA and then obviously continued on through WWE. And
yeah, he did one with the Ultimate Warrior actually back in the day. Yeah, that's I guess that's where the heat came from because he's always said Warrior worked a little stiff on him.
Well, supposedly, I think like Warrior had him up at a press slam and kind of dropped him awkwardly, and I guess he hurt himself. Bobby.
Yeah, I don't think Warrior doesn't seem like the type of guy that was trying to protect his opponents by any means.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I had heard about that. But obviously, in terms of like having comedic matches like that, Bobby was just great, really underrated as being able to sell and take a beating as well as he did.
Tremendously, yes.
Yeah, he was able to he was, like you said, Corey, he was just a bumping machine, and that carried over into his managing career. He was just great at just really giving the fans what they wanted, especially the fans that wanted to see him get beat down. He did not disappoint when it came to that.
Oh, yeah. You could see, even with a guy like Mr. Perfect Kurt Hennig, who would do the flip bump off of clotheslines and stuff like that. That's classic Bobby Heenan, that back flip bump that he would always do.
Yeah, Flair does it, HBK does it.
Exactly.
Heenan does it too.
Yeah.
That's pure Bobby Heenan influence right there.
I remember his feud. The very first live event I went to at the Nassau Coliseum, I got to see him fight the Big Boss Man. Remember their legendary feud?
Oh, yeah.
He was putting down Boss Man's mother for months on commentary.
Oh, jeez.
Oh, my God. It was horrendous.
Classic stuff. Classic.
Yeah.
I'm sure. No, getting back to the Weasel Suit matches, I'm trying to think of, what sort of was influenced by that. The only example that comes to mind for me is years ago TNA used to have stuff for their Thanksgiving episodes where it's like you'd have the loser, and it would usually be like Eric Young or somebody, like the loser would have to wear a turkey suit.
Yeah.
And like that was definitely clearly an homage to Bobby Heenan and the Weasel Suit, but it's surprisingly WWE hasn't really gone to that well quite a bit in terms of like using the suit as a humiliation device.
Yeah, not so much. I think last time we saw something like that was probably last one I can think of is the Brian Pillman wears a dress angle.
Yeah.
Back at like 97.
Was that the one where like the 1, 2, 3 kid had to wear a diaper, or was that after that?
That was actually the year before that. That was the Crybaby match.
Right.
But still, I mean, it's definitely all in the same token of the ultimate comeuppance for a heel, especially a cowardly heel.
Right. Yeah, I think a lot of that went out with the Attitude Era.
Yeah, I think really that's kind of a good point with the Attitude Era. A lot of the subtlety and the witty humor that Bobby Heenan kind of brought to the table was shoved out aside for the more beat you over the head style of humor, which that's funny and obviously it was successful. But going back and watching these old Heenan and Monsoon exchanges, it's perfect comedy. I mean, as many people have eulogized Bobby Heenan, the guy could have made a fortune in late night television or being a comedic host of any kind.
Yeah, I think that it's fitting to call him the Johnny Carson of wrestling.
For sure.
When he got that nickname. It's very appropriate.
I mean, I can imagine that maybe during the Attitude Era, maybe that style of humor was looked at as a little bit dated, as a little bit generational. But obviously, it's like, it's one of those things. It's like listening to your dad, tell a few jokes or something. Yeah, maybe it doesn't age as well, but you still laugh at it.
Yeah, I still laugh anytime I hear Heenan's comment. That's how you can tell it holds up.
For sure.
Over time, it still makes me laugh out loud anytime I hear him say the stuff I've heard him say 1,000 times. Like that Royal Rumble. It's still funny to me.
For sure, and he was definitely of that generation, where very much like a Don Rickles style thing. And
yep.
From what I hear, when he first left WWE, supposedly he was trying to make it, a little bit more, not necessarily Hollywood, but like trying to get on like commercials or ad campaigns or something before WCW came up. So it does make you wonder like how far he would have gotten outside of wrestling in the entertainment industry.
I think there definitely was a place for him somewhere outside of the wrestling industry.
Yeah. And it is kind of a shame that he never really got to branch out like that, because I think he would have done really well.
No, but till the very end, he was still, waiting to see his fans, and you got to hand it to him for doing that.
Absolutely. And according to his wife, certainly in his later years, that like he really enjoyed going to the conventions, even when he wasn't in great health. But just seeing the fans and reconnecting with some of the older wrestlers and the older people in the business that he came up with, it must have been good for him, certainly in those years.
I think that speaks a lot about his character, being the type of person to not just sit back and wait to take the ass kicking. He went out and met every day head on and said, you know what, I'm going to make the best of it.
Bret Hart just said he was one of the toughest people to ever come out of the wrestling business because of his battle with cancer over the years.
For sure.
And for Bret Hart to say that, he's been through a lot.
Absolutely. Oh, I also see apparently Bobby did appear in the early days of TNA, for a little bit.
Bobby Roode.
Yeah. So he definitely did have a little tenure in that, but I mean, who knows what kind of condition he was in at that point. I had actually seen him, I want to say in 2003 or 2004 at an indie show in Largo. And I think Kurt Hennig was there, and Sean Waltman was there as well. It was at I want to say it was like the Pinellas County Expo Center in Pinellas Park.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it was like an NWA Florida IPW thing, and it was kind of cool to see him there. But he was still having trouble talking at that point.
Yeah. His Hall of Fame speech is actually a really good one too, even though he's he addresses why his speech starts to sound a little bit different than normal. But he was hilarious as usual.
But yeah, no, it's he was definitely one of a kind, and it's cool to hear like guys like Corey Graves who are trying to continue on in that legacy, or at least in that vein. But yeah, no, he will definitely be missed. Before we go, Cory, do you have a particular favorite memory or particular favorite moment from Bobby Heenan?
It's hard to not pick the 1992 Royal Rumble, as Brian mentioned, because that was really, he was just firing on all cylinders on that one. But generally speaking, I would say his run on commentary between 91 and 93, he was just really on his A game. It's really hard to pick just one moment for Bobby Heenan. I don't want any new fans who aren't really familiar with his work to see this as hyperbole, but you really have to go back and watch all of this stuff to appreciate just how many great moments the guy had. It's almost impossible to nail it down as just one, but Bobby was maybe the best ever. I really don't think there's anybody else who can top what he did. And if you ask a lot of the other people who are called the greatest manager or the greatest commentary or play-by-play, they'll tell you Bobby was better. So to put it simply, Bobby was the best. This one hurts. This one's tough. I share a birthday with Bobby. So, it's going to be a rough birthday this year, knowing that I won't be celebrating along with Bobby Heenan.
For sure, Brian. In your opinion, do you think Heenan could have had a career as a stand-up?
I was going to say I was hoping you were going to mention that maybe when he wasn't trying to get into wrestling that he would have tried that. I wasn't sure if he ever did or not, but I think he might have done pretty decent because I saw plenty of stand-up. He could have done what Mick Foley did.
Right.
And done like the Q&A and tell some stories, and his wit would have been perfect in that setting, I think. But no, I think the main reason we look at those early pay-per-views, those early WrestleManias as being so good, it's not the wrestling, it's certainly not the Hulk Hogan matches that you're seeing. It's the banter between Bobby Heenan and Gorilla or Jesse and Vince, and you really can't replace these guys once they're gone. So I consider Bobby Heenan not one of the greatest, but the greatest. I don't know if Corey's just said that, but I see a lot of people saying he's one of the greatest of all time. Like, I can't think of anybody better. He is my favorite all time manager, commentator, wrestling personality, other than Roddy Piper, who was the last person we did a tribute show for. So now, just think of how I feel. There's very
absolutely.
jaded.
I know he I know he and Gorilla, always meant a lot to you personally as a kid.
I consider them like second grandparents growing up. I'm not ashamed to say it. They taught me a lot about like how to verbally express myself and how to have a comeback ready. How to just be. People always say, "Oh, you're quick-witted." I guarantee I got it from Gorilla and Bobby.
Yeah, Bobby was like that really like funny uncle that you would run into.
Yeah, I wish I had an uncle like Bobby the Brain.
For sure. I mean, as a comic, how would you describe sort of like his style and how that's impacted you?
No, like I said, he's definitely it sounds like a joke or like a rib that I would include Bobby Heenan amongst my all-time favorite comedic influences. Just this, it has a reactionary type of comedian. That's where I feel like I'm best when I'm reacting to something, not bringing it up on. Like Bobby Heenan never brought up great points on his own. It was always Gorilla making a point, and then Bobby having an interjection that was usually ridiculous.
Yeah,
but that's I love that style of humor.
If you were to compare comedy to a fight, Bobby Heenan was the greatest counterpuncher of all time.
For
Absolutely.
Sure.
Yeah.
He almost had that like Rodney Dangerfield way of just like slipping stuff in there when you least expect it.
And then when he would be on camera too, there was something he did with Mean Gene at that gimmick battle royal where he refused to shake his hand. He just kept turning around. He'd put his finger up.
Yeah, he'd have little subtleties like that.
And like that's amazing to me. Like that's without even saying a word. He was making me crack up.
Not only that, and he was a physical comedian too.
Good old-fashioned slapstick.
Yeah, it's very silly, but I think they filmed something once where he was a stuntman or he had a stuntman.
Yes.
For primetime wrestling, some kind of Western setting. I vaguely
yes.
And I remember him doing stunts and stuff. Like I feel like it would have been great in like a Western movie type of thing with, who knows, him and Gorilla or Lord Alfred.
Well, I mean, I imagine him in like a Mel Brooks type of movie, in like a Blazing Saddles thing. Like he would have been perfect in like that sort of ensemble.
I don't have any doubt in my mind. Yeah.
And not to jump in, but I have to mention this too is one of the great Bobby Heenan moments on those old Coliseum video WWF tapes.
Oh,
all these little side segments, and they did one that was golfing with Bobby Heenan. And
that's perfect. I was going to mention that too.
and Gene saying, "Bobby, it's time to take your shot. You have to come up and address the ball." Of course, with no pause, Bobby says, "Hello, ball."
You have to address your ball.
Right. It's just it's one of those things. It's like that type of joke, even as cheesy as that is, like he could just pull it off and you still laugh anyway.
You could tell though they filmed those in one take, and that was just his first reaction each time, which he was a one take wonder.
Yeah.
Those Coliseum video segments are definitely worth checking out too if you can find them on YouTube or something.
I think a lot of those things are up on the network as well. Like I even have some of them are like I think DVD extras on the Saturday Night's Main Event DVD that came out a few years ago.
Yeah, definitely have that one.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna ride my camel backwards into the sunset.
Yes. Of course. Well, that's
for all the humanoids and ham and eggers out there.
Exactly. Definitely. I mean, I'm glad you guys were able to do this. With me, obviously, to talk about, sort of celebrate the life and career of Bobby Heenan. I know he meant a lot to all of us. This was great. I couldn't have thought of like two better guys to like talk about this guy with.
Yeah, like I said, man, there could be no Heenan tribute without me.
Of course.
I'm a huge fan.
Absolutely.
You're definitely hearing from two of the biggest Bobby Heenan marks that ever walked the planet, and that's one of the greatest things about Bobby is with him passing, you really realize just how many of us were Bobby Heenan marks. And
to this day, I still can't hear the word Haku without saying God bless you immediately after.
That's great. When I posted about it on Facebook earlier today, I had a lot of like reactions from people who I didn't even know were wrestling fans, but they probably grew up, listening to Bobby Heenan.
I think everybody knows that name.
Yeah.
Bobby the Brain. It's like Jake the Snake. It's legendary.
Yeah, certainly if you're of like around our age or a little bit older, like if you grew up in the 80s, people kind of remember that. Even if they didn't stay wrestling fans, that's just how much of a part of pop culture it was at the time.
Yeah, I'm just glad we have all this this stuff to watch on the network now.
Absolutely.
It's a great way to remember him.
And they're gonna add collections and stuff like that probably soon on the network, and
that'd be sweet.
They're great about that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I think we'll try and wrap it up here for now, guys. Cory, what is going on in the world of Chronocord at the moment?
Well, we are currently working on our third album. We're finishing some extra tracking, mixing, and mastering. You can go check out our first two albums and all the other stuff we're doing at chronocord.com, chronochord.com. And you can also find us on YouTube at youtube.com/chronocord. Go ahead and go on over there and hit us up. Give us a like, sub, share, tell your friends, tell your grandma, tell your pets, everybody.
Tell your pets.
Absolutely. No, Chronocord, for those of you who don't know, they're an instrumental music collaboration between Cory and my old partner, Justin Cully, from the Impatient Nation days. Those guys have They compose a lot of really cool music, really cool instrumental music, a lot of different genres. Definitely check out their website and their services. And Brian, you are actually on Twitter now at Brain Colony.
Yeah, I finally got it, man. Finally simplified it, made it easy for myself. I barely use the thing, but if you want to hit me up on there, you go ahead.
For sure.
I'd like to hear from fellow Bobby Heenan marks out there.
For sure. I know you don't really have a lot of stand-up gigs at the moment, but I know that you've been playing out in a few bands recently.
Yeah, I've been playing in two different bands, and one of them we have a band camp. It's called Veird, Veird, which is very appropriate for somebody like me to be in a band like that. It's what we call disaster rock, where it's all just improv. We switch instruments. I play guitar, drums, keyboards, bass, and just let it loose. And we record every Tuesday night, and we put an album out on Thursday.
Wow. Very
so
cool.
Something new to check out. Yeah.
That's awesome. I didn't even know about all that. I will definitely have to check that out, and love to hear more about that at a future time. But for now we'll probably wrap it up here. Thank you guys for listening to the Phoenix Report. We've just been having a lot of really cool new guests recently. Those of you who are wrestling and music fans probably have heard my most recent episode with Billy Gray from Fozzy. Definitely had a lot of really cool musicians have been on it. I think my next one is going to be one of the members of Trapped, the band from the early 2000s. I recently recorded a little interview with one of their guys, so I'll be posting that soon. Definitely a lot of cool stuff happening lately here at the Phoenix Report. We don't just cover wrestling, we cover music, we cover movies, we cover whatever else is going on that I feel like talking about with my friends, and we like to have a good time here. So please check me out on Twitter at jackxconnor. That's JACKXCONNOR. Like me on Facebook, facebook.com/jackconnormusic. You can check out my band, facebook.com/vertebreakerband. My band, Vertebreaker, hard rock band. I think you guys would like us a lot. And, if you're on YouTube, iTunes, click like, keep subscribing, go back and listen to all the other episodes. Thank you guys for listening. We'll see you later. Bye.